So, welcome to this evening on how to become an anti-racist educator. So, this webinar is sponsored by Sharp Education Consulting and Higher Learning Unlimited. My name is Sharisha Barrett. I'm the founder and owner of Sharp Education Consulting. We specialize in diversity, equity, inclusion training and education. I am a former teacher, and I decided that I wanted to really figure out how can I be in a position where I was going to be able to have a macro impact. So about 4 years ago, after I saw how divided our country became, I decided to go into focusing on social justice education. When we have these conversations, especially about conversations on race, we don't want the conversations to stop. So you can follow us on Sharp Education Consulting, Sharp Education on Twitter, and Sharp Education on Instagram. Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Shabazz. I am the Chief Learning Officer of Higher Learning Unlimited. And so like Shar, I have a consulting firm, and our focus is on libraries, literacy, and learning. I'm a former classroom teacher. I've become a school librarian. I've worked in public libraries, a large public library system, as a coordinator of their children's programming. And through my work as a career educator, I happened on a great opportunity to write a book that will be finished and out for publication this summer called Engaging Boys of Color at the Library. And so in that book, I talk about 8 proven strategies for reading achievement as it deals with African American and Latino boys. And so I am just very excited to be here this evening. This is my first time doing a webinar, so show me some grace. And I'm just very glad that Shar has invited me to be able to be in conversation with all of you.
Great. So we know when we have conversations about race that you are going to experience discomfort. Just get used to it because it is a difficult topic. We want to create an environment where everyone is able to speak their truth. We want you to stay engaged and show respect to one another. We want you to understand that everyone has his or her story, and we want to be respectful of that. In addition to that, we want to tell you that racism will not be tolerated. So some of you have already started doing this, but we want you to state your position, your city and state, and why are you here? Why did you take time out of your busy evening to join us on this conversation about race? So the first thing that I want to ask you is, who are you? As individuals, we are multi-dimensional. We have multiple dimensions. So when we think about gender, race, your sexual orientation, that's a part of your personal identity. When we're talking about political affiliation, social economic status, and geographic location, that is part of your social identity. All these factors contribute to who you are as an individual. I want you to tell me, of these dimensions, which 2 identifiers are the most important to you? Which identifiers are the most important to you? Let's put some stuff in the chat box for me, please. Anyone can tell me which of these identifiers are the most important to you? Is it your race? Is it your age? Is it your gender? Which ones are the most important to you? Some people said their educational level. Who else? Ethnicity and generation, political affiliation, educational level and geographic location. Perfect. Now, what about I want you to think about a little bit further. Which of these identifiers have a negative impact on how you maneuver life? So if you were looking at these identifiers, which ones have make it difficult for you to maneuver life? Is it your race and your race and gender? Is it your ethnicity and your position? Who can tell me that? Okay. So people say religion, gender, religion, socioeconomic status. Anybody else? Make sure that some of you I see are sending messages privately. Make sure you have it so everyone else can see. Perfect. So what is race? Race is a social construct, and this is something that started, during the 1500s. It is a way where you artificially classify people based on their physical attributes, based on their hair texture, based on the skin, or how much melanin is in a person's skin, based on their physical, facial or physical features. One thing about race that I want you to really take in consideration, that we share 99.9% of the same DNA. Doesn't matter where you're from. If you're white, if you're black, if you're Asian, we share 99.9% of the same DNA. Racist. So when we think about the word racist, those are those individuals who are committed to upholding racist policies, practices in place. Those individuals are committed to upholding the racist policies and practices. Those group of people are those ones who treat people differently based on their association with another race. So Angela Davis, she's actually the one who coined the term anti-racist. She states, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. So when we think about non-racist, those are those individuals that are always saying, I don't see color. I don't see color, I'm colorblind. How does that impact on how you live life? If you're that individual saying that I don't see color, it is important for you to notice people holistically. Those are the same people, when they see injustice, they don't say anything. They just let things slide. So it's important for us to be mindful of the difference between being a racist, a non-racist, and an anti-racist. Now we know Dr. Kendi is known for his book on how to be an anti-racist. When we think about how to be an anti-racist, we're thinking about individuals who are not in the background. They're not standing in the background. They're actually standing right beside those people of color. They're standing by their side. They're saying that I think those policies and those practices are unfair. I am here to help you. I'm going to either write to our senators, our elected officials. I'm going to protest with you. I am working with you for this cause. So there are 5 different types of racism. First type of racism is individual racism. That is those are the personal beliefs that you have about people. Those personal biases that you share by yourself that you don't share with others. Interpersonal racism has to do with how you interact with people. Do you treat certain people different because of their racial background? Do you treat people different because of their religious beliefs? So when you think about discrimination, that is interpersonal racism. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism are all examples of interpersonal racism. Institutional racism has to do with organizations. If you think about banks, governmental agencies, school systems, the criminal justice system, those are institutions, they are organizations. So when we think about redlining, where certain places were designated as being less desirable to live based on African Americans living there, or if you see that children of color are 4 times as much suspended or expelled than white children, or when you think about predatory loans during the housing market, those are all examples of institutional racism. When we think about structural racism, we're talking about history, how our country was built. So the example that I can think about is Bacon's Rebellion. This is where the concept of white started during Bacon's Rebellion. That is when Nathaniel Bacon was a relative of William Bexley. Bacon wanted to move westward and take over Native American land. William Bexley felt that it was not a good idea. So he decided to build a multiracial militia comprised of white indentured servants and Black slaves. And so he told them, if you work with me, you will get your freedom. So the plantation owners were like, we cannot have a multiracial alliance. We have to develop a system where we cannot allow those Black slaves to have the same rights as these poor whites. So what they did, they gave the indentured servants who were white land, their rights, their freedom, and guns. And they told the slaves that they were going to be slaves for the rest of their lives. Cultural racism, that has to do with who establishes the norms in the society. This country was created for white men. And so when I say that, our founding forefathers were white, heterosexual, Protestant men. And the reason why I'm making an emphasis on Protestant, we have to understand that the term white is constantly changing, because we already know that Irish, people who were Irish or people from Southeastern Europe were not considered white for a very long time. But during the 1920s, they received, quote unquote, their white cards. So we know that Christianity is the most popular religion in the world, but we know that people who are not Christians are treated unfairly because of their religious beliefs. This is also a conversation on what we consider as being beauty. You know, typically we think of blonde hair and blue eyes. When we think about that, we think about what Hitler would say, the ideal person, the Aryan race. That's one thing. But we also know through this concept of assimilation, there are white children. As a former teacher, I've worked in urban and affluent school districts, and I've seen that some of the white children don't know about their past. If you ask them, what is your ethnicity? They don't know. If you ask them, what do you celebrate to honor your ethnicity? They'll say, I celebrate Christmas, I celebrate Hanukkah, but they don't say anything about their European ancestry. And so it's important for our students to really know about their past. So the next question I want you to put in the chat box is, what is white supremacy? In the chat box, I want you to write down, what is white supremacy? Anybody? I want to see if somebody put some definitions of white supremacy. Cindy says, believing whites are better than everyone else. Anybody else want to add something to it? The system privileging of whiteness throughout society. Thank you, Michael. Superior, smarter, have more rights. The belief that white race is superior than other races. Thank you. False belief that whites are better than other races. Great. So white supremacy, the belief that white people are superior to those of all other races, especially the Black race, and should be therefore be the dominant race, society. How does this concept of white supremacy have an impact in your organization or how you maneuver life today? I want you to just keep thinking about that question as we go through this presentation. So first thing you need to do, as I stated before, think about your organization. Some of you work in higher ed, some of you work in K through 12, or some of you work with organizations that deal with children. One thing I want you to think about is, what is your position? Does your position grant you power? What type of power do you have? What type of privileges do you have? Are you able to be your authentic self? Are you able to speak up when you see injustice? Think about your position in a way, do they are receptive to be inclusive to people that do not fit the ideal norm? So these are just questions that I want you to start thinking about as we go through this presentation. Data. Think about quantitative and qualitative data that you currently have or that you are going to gather about your organization. If you're talking about a school setting, which individuals are getting expelled or suspended? Which demographics? How many employees do you have? How many of them are Latinx? How many of them are Asian? How many of them are white? How many are Black? How many of them are Native American? How many of your students, especially if you're higher ed or if you're talking about K through 12, how many of your students are in advanced placement courses? How many people are staying in your workplace? Are there Black and whites, Black or Latinx? Are they leaving your organization or are they staying? What type of climate does your organization have? Are you inclusive? Are you welcoming? And who has the positions? So when we think about positions, you know, do you have a lot of African American teachers in your organizations? Do you have a lot of African Americans in leader positions? Do you have any Asians? Do you have any Latinx? This is an opportunity for you to gather all the data that you need so you can figure out what the problem is with your organization. So the first thing you need to think about as you go through this journey, you need to have your emotional intelligence, your EQ. We know we've all heard of your IQ when we're talking about how to measure intellect, but your EQ has to do with having a solid understanding of who you are as a person. First thing you have to think about is your self-awareness. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Think about your social awareness is how you interact with people. Do you treat certain people differently because of their race, because of their religious beliefs, because of their ethnicity? Motivation. What are your intrinsic and extrinsic motivators that cause you to excel at your workplace? The other thing is empathy. Are you able to look, or are you able to walk in look through other people's lens whenever difficult situations occur in your organization? And lastly, self-regulation or self-management. Do you know how to manage your behavior or your emotions when you encounter difficulty? Do you know what your triggers are? Those are things you need to be mindful first when you're dealing with people from diverse backgrounds. So this is the cultural iceberg. When you meet people, you only know 10% of that person, of those. You only know 10%. You don't know 90% of people. You only know 10%. You only know what you see. So that's why we'll say the tip of the iceberg. You know, you're able to tell what people are based on the food that they eat, based on the music that they listen to, and the clothing they wear. But you don't know anything else until you start having dialogue with those individuals. You don't know how they communicate with each other. You don't know anything about their customs. You don't know about their religious beliefs. You don't know those things until you really start having some conversations with different cultures. One thing about America, we're individualistic. We worry about ourselves. Other countries have a collectivist way of thinking. They don't think about themselves. The other way is time. The way that we manage time is different than other people from other countries. The way that we greet people is different. The different gestures means different from one country to the next. For example, the okay symbol means differently in other countries. It's a derogatory gesture in other countries. You really, when you want to start learning about your co-employees, or you want to start learning about your students, you have to learn how to dig deep, go beyond the surface. You need to know yourself. You need to know your story. I tell people all the time, the best gratification that I've had over the last 10 years is actually doing my genealogy. I'm able to learn about my past. I'm able to find out that my great grandfather was a teacher. I was able to find that out because I did my genealogy. But you also not just knowing about your past, we know how your past influenced why things are the way they are. You even need to know the past of your students or your employees so you can be able to develop healthy relationships with them. So one thing, if I know many of you know about Jane Elliott, she is my idol, as I say, because she has the courage to say things that I don't have the courage to say. But one thing she said is that the map that we've been accustomed to is not the correct map. Now this map here looks like it's accurate, but most of the maps that we have seen over the years are not accurate. And so when we look at this world map, the reason why that the map that we saw growing up, that the maps was not accurate, was because the Pope wanted to show as if that Christianity was the most popular religion in the world. It is. However, a lot of times we know that this falsehood or these things that we see every day that we grew up is not accurate. And it's all based on white supremacy. But we also have to think about that cultures and race and that races are not monolithic. What I mean by that is that all Asian people are not Chinese. And China is the most populated country in the world. And so that, even when we think about that, China has different cultures within that country. Same thing, Mexico. When we think about Mexicans, we know a lot of Mexicans feel like we didn't land on you. We didn't land on you, you landed on us. And they're like, people from Mexico do not have the same type of heritage as someone from Brazil, because people from Brazil, they speak Portuguese. I want you to really think about making sure when you're interacting with people, don't put them all under one umbrella. Think about them as individuals. So there are two type of assessments that you can take to recognize your biases. One is from the Anti-Defamation League, which is called the Personal Assessment on Anti-Bias Behavior. The one is also the Harvard IAT. These are two assessments that you can take so you can be aware of who you are as a person, and so you can be able to identify your biases. So here are some strategies I want you to start thinking about. We want to ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion is embedded in your mission, vision, and values. We also want to be mindful that you do not use bias-free language. We know that we live in an environment that we have to be inclusive of all people. Use people's preferred pronouns. Also make sure that you, whenever you talk about slavery, say enslaved people. Also, because you're dealing with the LGBTQI population, some people prefer using they. So use the word police officer, male person, making sure that you use language that is as neutral as possible. Develop a shared vocabulary. So if you're talking about prejudice, racism, race, make sure that vocabulary is clear in your organization, that is in your policies, that is written down. Or if you're talking about, especially in higher ed or K through 12, you want to inform your students what does racism, discrimination, race, what those things actually look like in your organization. In the corporate world, they have employee resource groups where people work together, try to advocate on behalf of their social group. So for example, if you might have an LGBTQ group, you might have an African American group. So just, those are things that you might take in consideration to try to make changes in your organization. Look, think, create, do a SWOT analysis on your organization. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What type of changes you need to make in your to address systemic and institutional racism? Just don't focus on cultural diversity, but also linguistic diversity. We know, and I've seen on Instagram and all through social media, how there are people who are telling people, go back to your homeland. We speak English here. How do you create an environment where everyone feels included? So make sure that you have marketing material in Spanish. Make sure that you use pictures. We know that we got to take in consideration of people of our deaf people who are deaf. How do you take in consideration to being inclusive of those individuals just as well? Marketing materials. Students and people that work in your organization, they need to be able to see themselves. Making sure that you have pictures that represent people from diverse backgrounds. Provide diversity, equity, inclusion training for your organization. Implicit bias, the history of race. How do those things impact your organization? Focus on how you can be an ally. Someone that's going to stand up when they see injustice. Teach your students on how to be an ally. You can do lunch and learns, and you can have book discussions. The other thing is that you want to create an environment where your students feel welcome or your employees feel welcome. So when we think about just like sexual harassment procedures, you need to have procedures concerning about hate and biases. Do you have a reporting system put in place? Can your students come to you when they feel like they're treated unfairly? Can your employees come to you when they feel like they're treated unfairly? Do you have a statement included in your syllabus or in your policy that address hate and biases? Do you have funding to provide trips to historical sites in your city or in your state? Those are things to take in consideration. We want to create a welcome environment. To go back what I was saying about the hate and the bias, we know how suicide does impact people in color. And so we want to make sure that we try to create environments where our students or our co-employees are able to speak their truth. So journaling is a good way. You can have a personal journal, you can have your students' journal, prompting those questions, because the biggest thing, we want them to be able to reflect, and we want them to be able to transfer their thoughts onto paper, because we know how therapeutic that process is. Have your employees or your students write autobiographies. This is something that you might want to take in consideration so you can be able to know their backstories. We know that as I stated before, adverse childhood experiences. We know that students sometimes encounter adverse childhood experience that impact on how they end up becoming, that impacts them, their adulthood. We want to take that in consideration. Here's some journal prompts you might want to take in consideration. How and when did you learn about race? When did you first learn that you were part of a racial group? When did you learn that there were different racial groups than your own? When did you learn about this institution about race? LEAP framework, which is a good framework to take in consideration of. As a Black person, I know the struggle of being Black. So think about your employees, they already know what it is. So it's for other people from other backgrounds to learn about that journey. Listen and learn from your Black colleagues and students. They already listen and learn from them. If you have a question, just ask them prompting questions so you can be able to know about their journey. Engage with your Black colleagues and your students in different settings, not just in a work environment. If your students have different festivals, baseball, soccer, or they doing something to honor who they are. Like, for example, years ago when I was a teacher, I went to a Puerto Rican festival to see one of my students perform. Also, ask Black employees about their work and goals. Maybe you can serve as a mentor for him or her. Maybe you can support them in some type of way. Same thing with ask and provide. What type of suggestions and support can you help them be successful in their career? Oops. The other thing is that I want you to take in consideration is that every city, state has its own story. Think about how your community where you work, how it's changed over time. Look at citywide district data. Think about how many people, how has the community changed from 50 years ago? Are the same people living there? Why or why not? The other thing you want to take in consideration, does that community that you reside, does it have hospitals, grocery stores, fast foods? You want to pretty much figure out how where you work has changed over time. The reason why I want you to think about that is because we want to talk about how this impacts students' performance, or just how does it impact your organization on a whole. Because we know when integration happened, white flight happened. And when white flight happened, we know that what ended up happening is that students attend schools that are not equitable because they do not have the same type of resources readily available. So here are some books that you can start taking into consideration. Courageous Conversations About Race from Glenn Singleton, Let's Talk from Teaching Tolerance, and Crucial Conversations. And I'm also going to send you a list of those books that I recommended too in the follow-up email. So another strategy is called intergroup dialogue. And so if you've ever participated in circle conversations, you can do a small group, a group of 10, or you can do have one person serve as a facilitator, and then you can have tables of 10, however way you want to go about doing it. But it has 4 stages. The first stage is where you set the tone for the dialogue, whoever the facilitator is. That's where you talk about your ground rules, what your expectations are, your goals, and what your goals for the conversation. Stage 2, that is where you might share your story. So for example, if I was a facilitator, I might share the first time that I've experienced racism. And then I would ask my participants, state a time when you've experienced racism. How did it make you feel? So normally in stage 2, that is your story, your personal story. It's a story, it's the stage related to your personal identity. Stage 3 has to do with your organization. So this might be a question like, well, have you ever experienced racism in your organization? Or how would you describe racism at your workplace or at your school. This is an opportunity where you're moving from self to social, talking about how does this concept of racism impact your organization. And that is something where you as a facilitator will start off the conversation and the participants will share their stories throughout the circle. And the fourth stage is action planning. How are you going to rectify this issue of racism in your organization? What type of strategies are you going to use? I will also share you some information about websites that you can use for intergroup dialogue too. Talk moves is the last one, and then I'm gonna share moving on to Nicole. Accountable talk. We know this is a big language that's used in K to 12, but it's also something that you can use, especially when you work on higher ed or when you start having discussions about race in your organization. So revoice is that step in talk move where you're talking about where you need clarity about something that your student said. So this is what you're saying. You might use that sentence stem or this questioning stem. This is what you're trying to say. This is so you get clarity of what your students are trying to say in the conversation. Restate. This is an opportunity for you to paraphrase, you or a student to paraphrase what the other person is thinking. Agree or disagree. This is an opportunity to say, do you agree or you don't, or do you agree or disagree? Why? So you can use that sentence prompt or that question stem to try to prompt out and get more about that dialogue. Specific example, especially, when we're talking about getting the students to be prepared to cite why they support something. This will be a good example. How do you support this? Why do you support? Can you give me an example? Add on. You might ask your student, well, oh, I want to add on to it. Do you want to add on to what he or she said? That's another way that you can think about doing it. Making an analogy so people can be able to see, this is what you're trying to say this way, where you're comparing one thing to another. Call to action. This is actually, typically student initiated, where it's the opportunity for students to say, well, these are the next steps. What can we do next in order to try to address this issue? So if you just type talk moves, you'll be able to get some strategies that way. Nicole, you ready?
I am. So now I am going to share my screen, yes? Okay, so it is telling me that you have to allow me to share my screen, Char.
Okay. Make host.
Okay. So, hang on.
Bear with us.
Okay.
You're ready.
All right, I'm just pulling up. It says I'm sharing my screen. I'm trying to see it here. 1 second, guys. All right, so we're going to start on my slides here. And I'm going to kind of pick up on what Shar was talking about in terms of knowing your students and building those relationships. So the whole idea about differentiation that I'm sure you guys are already very familiar with, but is definitely a key pedagogical practice in education. But when we're working to become anti-racist educators, differentiation is critical to connecting with your students. It allows you to go beneath the surface and to build authentic relationships with your learners that will positively impact them and allow them to develop into their full selves as students. And so some of the ways that you can do that to learn more about your students, Shar talked about and showed the visual of that iceberg, and many of you have probably seen that graphic before, but it's really about how, what we see on the outside is just so minimal compared to what we really are about on the inside. And how we engage our young people will help us to be able to develop those relationships that move the needle on race and give them safe space environments to be able to talk about issues that concern them as it relates to race, racism, and inequity. So interest inventories, the multiple intelligences, there are many different instruments out there that can be used to gauge multiple intelligences, learning different learning modalities, teacher inventories, and there's an example of one on the next slide that I'll share, and just surveying your students, asking your students. Sometimes I think we forget about that in education. You know, we work for students and we want to do the best for our students, but so very often we miss opportunities to just simply survey our students, to ask our students what their thoughts are, and to allow that information to drive our curriculum. So as I mentioned, here's an example of the teacher inventory on differentiation practices and strategies from the book, the cover that you saw previously, Making Differentiation a Habit. And as Shar mentioned, we will provide you guys with a list of reading materials. So a lot of what we're talking about today and addressing, we will share that with you so that you have a reference and a resource for that. So, of course, we know when we're developing our curriculum, our anti-racism, our anti-bias curriculum, when we're really thinking meaningfully, lesson planning is also very important. So, providing those rich curricular experiences that engage students and help speak truth to power. So I'm sharing here a graphic of the layered curriculum. It's an instructional, a tiered level instructional design practice. And I just love, love, love Kathy Nunley. When I was a classroom educator, I happened on the layered curriculum as an instructional design model that allowed my students choice and voice. And so assignments began at the basic knowledge and understanding, Bloom's taxonomy. That was the C level. And then we went to, analysis. And we moved on through Bloom's taxonomy to synthesis and evaluation, and then finally to product building or creation, just the highest level when we redeliver and when we share what we know with others. That is so powerful. And so I found that engaging this level of curriculum in this very differentiated, specialized way, and kind of her mantra has been the practical solution for teachers with more than one student in their classroom. And of course, that is the case for all educators. And sometimes it can be really frustrating when we want to think about how is it, we know all of our students are different and they come with different needs, backgrounds, and experiences, but how can we develop lessons, curricular experiences, and activities that engage them, that affirm them, and that inspire them to go out in the world and make differences. And so I found this instructional design model to be very powerful to that end, because it provides so much choice and voice for students to be able to think about what it is that, again, their thoughts, how they want to express themselves in the world, and being able to redeliver that knowledge, again, which is the strongest way for us to retain information. So that will be shared as well, some information on how you can get more about the layered curriculum. Also, the 1619 project. So that's, oh, I'm sorry, guys, I moved too fast, but the 1619 project, how many of you are familiar with that? And you can just put your information in the chat. Now, Shar, I can't see from my vantage point just here. I don't see the chat. So can you let me know what the
so no, some people do. Some people are familiar, some people are not.
Okay. So, again, those who are familiar with the 1619 project, does anybody want to just kind of jump in, or if you've happened to engage with it?
What are your thoughts? Share your thoughts in the, do you like it? Some people say yes, don't know it.
Okay.
There are a lot of people don't know it.
Okay, so we're also going to share that the New York Times developed this curriculum, and it really talks about the 400 years since slavery and how pretty much every aspect and element of the United States, the historical context, has some function and impact around racism, discrimination, and equities, and how we can use a robust curriculum to really, again, speak truth to power and talk to young people about what our past is, connecting the dots and building a better future for everyone. So it's a really, really popular approach. It is, what I will tell you as well, there has been some controversy around it because, again, we don't always want to have conversations that are difficult. However, I think Shar talked about at the very beginning of the webinar is that these kind of conversations and being an anti-racist educator and doing this work by definition can be controversial. So we have to, as adults and people who are in the field to make differences for young people, we have to be able to have courage to stand on what our convictions are and believe that when we tell the truth, when we connect the dots, and when we work together to build a just and equitable future for all, that is a good thing. And over time, what may have been perceived as a negative to some, people will come on board. And so we're called to be teacher leaders as well. And so again, as I said, I'll share more about that. So, what do you want your students to know? The big ideas in your lessons, thinking about those lessons that are going to lead to those robust, very impactful conversations. And there's some other organizations that allow you to build off of lesson plans and standards and content that they've already created. So Teaching Tolerance, some of you I'm sure are familiar with that. The National Council for Social Studies, C3 Framework, College, Career, and Civic Life. The National Council of Teachers of English. And again, I mentioned the layered curriculum, as well. So there's so many different things. As a library and literacy professional, I would be remiss if I did mention We Need Diverse Books. And their website is just that, www.weneeddiversebooks.com. And it's a nonprofit grassroots organization that advocates for changes in the publishing industry as it relates to culturally relevant, resident, and multicultural books. So as we know, our nation is shifting, and some people call it the browning of America, but still in the publishing world, the majority of books that are written in children's publishing are written and the characters are either animals or the characters are white children or white characters. And so while that is starting to shift and the tide is stemming, it's still much work to be done. So as you're thinking about building your lessons, also think about how you can incorporate those relevant and resident books that help, again, to stem the tide of inequity and discrimination. Shar, are there any questions or comments that I need to address?
No.
Okay, so some examples, I already touched on Bloom's taxonomy before, and I know in the interest of time, I'm gonna have to move through quickly, but choice boards are very, very popular. And again, we're talking about the choice and voice, how we present the content, but still allow our students the opportunity to apply their knowledge in a way that is meaningful and impactful using Bloom's taxonomy. So some topics to consider as well when you are engaging, again, in these crucial yet courageous conversations include white supremacy, U.S. history and colonialism. So, the racial or historical context of race and racism in America, religion, and how religion can be a tool in some cases of oppression and discrimination based not only just on color, but on gender. So again, some of these kind of provocative topics, power analysis of political and economic systems, looking at our Constitution and Bill of Rights, which is definitely something that we all talk to students about, particularly in civics classes, but we want to kind of interrogate that when we talk about, all people are created equally and should be free. Has that always been the case in our nation from its inception? And how we have these conversations will help us, again, develop those more deep connections with our young people. One thing that we wanted to point out in the presentation too is that the struggle for freedom has been multifaceted. And, history will record that there have been far too few number of conscientious whites who fought that fight, but there were some. And we want to recognize that. We want to affirm that there were conscientious, courageous, committed, and convicted whites who were willing to stand up and fight for Black people and Indigenous people in the struggle for freedom and equality. We want to express that with our young learners because we want to help build courage for them to realize that as an individual, they can make a difference as well. These were ordinary people who knew, as Martin Luther King reminds us, is that the time is always right to do what is right. Very important, I think, to make our help our young people understand that. I think it's also a good reminder for our young people that so that they know that they can play an active role, not a passive role, but an active role in anti-racism and anti-discrimination. So as freedom fighter and voting rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who I just love, reminded us, everybody is free or nobody is free. That we are joined in the struggle for anti-racism, equity, and righteousness for all in this struggle. And I think that's a powerful lesson that we get as educators to share with young people. Quickly, some other ways to meaningfully engage as an anti-racist educator: essays, journal prompts, those critical conversations using topic webs, walkabouts where you might have a primary source document that you post that students really get to get that firsthand account of someone who's experiencing a difficult situation in society. Check-in slips, KWL charts, and the like. So anticipation guides was something when I was in the classroom, this was a very, very big thing. And students really hung on to a good anticipation guide would pull them into the curriculum. So here you see an example of two acronyms, BIPOC and APR. Would you guys write in the chat box if you know what those mean? Char, would you check that for me?
Mm-hmm.
What are we getting on that?
No, there are people said that some people knew, or some people know and some people don't know.
Okay.
So ABAR, I think, addressed both of them.
Okay, so Black, Indigenous, and People of Color is the BIPOC acronym, and ABAR, which is one that I've recently learned as well, which is anti-bias, anti-racism, or anti-bias, anti-racist. I'm going to just move quickly past the next slide because I did touch on just examples of primary source documents. And again, how that firsthand account is so very important when you are trying to engage students, especially connecting historical context to the present. You know, that was then, this is now, but how are things related? And the Library of Congress is a great resource. So there's an example of the primary source analysis tool. If you go to loc.gov, you can actually put in information about a particular primary source document, and it allows you to reflect and question. Char, I think somebody's
yeah, so make sure that you're on mute, guys.
Another example here is just of a actual primary source document, again, that you could use to engage students through a discussion, a colloquial discussion, or again, a gallery walk where they went around, they read a document, went around and kind of posted what their thoughts were about that primary source document. And then thinking about your curriculum. Do the textbooks really tell accurate stories about people that were enslaved or people that have been discriminated against? Thinking about what those books are actually expressing. So what we say sometimes is you can and you should judge a book by its cover. Sometimes it's necessary to do that. Not just the cover, but the content and what is being expressed in that book is also very important. And so it's important as anti-racist educators that you interrogate interrogate, excuse me, the curriculum and the textbooks that are being provided. And when you see things that are not what they should be, that you speak up as an ally, as an accomplice, as an educator who is saying that knowledge is power and information is important. And you want to make sure that what you are conveying to your students is accurate and expresses in the way that it possibly should. I'll move beyond this. Choice boards, already talked about that. These are some examples. Going back again to that critical lens. These are some examples, the perspectives. Who's telling the story? Who's in the story? What is the story expressing? Always be mindful in your nonfiction and your fiction text. And then role playing, so very important, because role playing allows our students to put themselves in the experience of another person and to develop that empathy, which is critical. Culturally responsive teaching. These are some examples. How you maintain high expectations in all aspects of your anti-racist teaching practices. So as you see here, those positive relationships with the community, cultural sensitivity, interviews, again, giving choice and voice, bringing in people from the community, interviews from people of different professions, allowing family members to be experts in areas that they know well and expressing that in the classroom. So those high expectations are so key. Les Brown reminds us that no one rises to low expectations. These are just a few examples of connecting with students digitally, creating a meme generator to come up with some funny, things to kind of lighten the mood, although we know that many of the topics that we will address will be very serious, but a way to bring seriousness, but also to be light about it as well. Flipgrid and Nearpod are some great digital tools to allow students to be interactive and have expression. And follow the leader. There are already people out there doing the great work that you're also doing. So at Clear the Air, at Disrupt Text, and at Educator, some really great Twitter feeds out there to follow, and Instagram that are doing great work. And again, we'll share more. And then cultural humility. Basically, us understanding that we don't have all the answers. No one does. While we're trying to do this work, we'll have foibles. We'll be fledgling in some areas. We'll fall down, but we'll get up. We'll continue to do the work. And it's important that we have grace for others and that we also have grace for ourselves. The fact that you're here and you want to be better in your anti-racist educator practice is what is the critical element. And then finally, what we wanted to leave you with the slide, and I'm sure many of you were as blown away as I was about the passing of Chadwick Boseman, as we all know and love as Black Panther. And so where he said here is, when I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I would not have a single bit of talent left and could say, I used everything you gave me. So we're all here as educators, and we're all teachers and students at some point. We're all on an assignment to live and love one another. We must decide which side of history do we want to be on. Based on what Chadwick Boseman said, he also added to that once when he remarked that we should all be superheroes in our own stories. So with that, I invite you all to go out there and make your anti-racist heroic mark on your students' lives. Thank you guys for attending our webinar tonight.
Do you have any questions? We want to give you our evaluation form. Any questions? If you have any questions, some of you can, none for me. Anyone else have any questions that you might have about any resources that we recommended for you? We will post, do you want us to record it? Yes, we're gonna record it for you. You took screenshot and notes. Does anyone want to get off the microphone and share anything? Yes, it will be recorded, so we will share the video with you, along with an evaluation too. Perfect. Perfect. Do you guys have any resources that you might recommend for your fellow colleagues to read? Any books or any resources that you might recommend? No. Well, we thank you. We went over 5 minutes. We try to be mindful of your time. If you don't have any more questions, oh, you got 7 sisters and a brother. That's something that you might recommend. Anybody else? Because what we'll do, we'll share anything that you might have said with the participants. What anti-racist pedagogy would you recommend for the universities? Same thing, the racial literacy. I know a lot of times as we think as K through 12 that it's not applicable to higher ed, but racial literacy, critical race theory will be applicable too. Mm-hmm. And there's the social political theory would be good for you to also look into. Well, a lot of the stuff, like I said, some of this, especially when we talk about, yes, we talk about pedagogy, but a lot, some of this stuff can be applicable on a university level just as well. There's a lot of times, as a person who do have experience working in higher ed and also K through 12, a lot of times, sometimes professors don't know that there are so much commonalities, or because some professors have not been former teachers, so they don't understand where the commonalities lie. So yes, some of the same. Anybody else have any other questions? Well, good evening, and hopefully you guys have a wonderful last couple of weeks of summer that we have. And we look forward to, please complete out the evaluation, because the biggest thing, and also think about what type of topics you would like to hear from us next. I know we gave you a little bit of everything, but we want to also be mindful in that we want to tailor professional development that's aligned with what you want. Nicole, would you like to say anything?
Well, absolutely. And I thank you guys for joining us tonight. And as Char said, we will be sharing some more resources, a vast amount of resources to really help you guys engage and continue to do this critical work. Again, as a library professional, I have a plethora of books that just about every slide I could recommend a book that would be useful. So I will be providing that book list as well. I think it's important. I know everybody here, is not from the same area of K through 12 education. I know there's some higher ed. And the big thing that I would leave you guys with is that anti-racist education, anti-bias education starts in pre-K. It starts before school. So this kind of education and being an educator in this realm is something that happens early on. So there's not one area where we can't have these discussions. So I'll be happy, especially if there's anybody that was on the call that were from the primary grades, to share some really great board books that you can utilize with your learners. But yes, thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.